Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 362 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory and my guest today is a documentary filmmaker, counsellor and equine therapist. When we last met Alex Gulland in episode 313, we discussed her transition from student to qualified practitioner. She joins us again to share her journey over the last 12 months and what she has learned. So with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 362 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly. Today, Rory and I are walking you through three different topics, starting off with ethical sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about working with clients who have a psychiatric diagnosis. We're then going to practice matters that's been beautifully teed up by Rory, where he spoke with Alex Gulland, speaking about her journey from being a student and then going into practice. So be sure to listen out to that one. And then into student services, where we recognise you students on your formal journey to become counsellors or psychotherapists or to learn those all important skills. And today we're going to be speaking about confidentiality, and specifically in relation to client presentations when we're writing case studies or using them as examples. What do we need to know about that? But we're starting off with that ethical, sustainable practice. Oh, and I have to put in as well that we have Sarah Henry, our roving reporter on the ground, out and about, bringing you the stuff that really matters, and that is in that student services section for you as well. But Rory, starting us off today, ethical, sustainable practice, we're speaking about working with clients who have a psychiatric diagnosis. I'm going to just self-declare as we go into this topic. It's not a topic that I know an incredible amount about, so I'm going to be certainly looking to you, Rory, to lead us on this one.
Yes, well, I'm going to start off by saying that, part of being a qualified practitioner, and certainly if you work for yourself, it's really good to have a working knowledge of what a psychiatric diagnosis is. And I know that, through training, we're told that psychiatry and counselling are two different things. But where they do meet is where you take on a client and they come in and they say, I've got a diagnosis. I'm schizophrenic, or I'm bipolar, or I've got clinical depression. And understanding, I think having an understanding of what a diagnosis is and how to work with it. So the first thing I would say is that diagnosis, if you have a diagnosis, it's usually done by either a psychiatrist or a psychologist, usually a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist is a doctor who has trained in areas of mental health and understands, and I'll come back to the understands part as we go, how the brain may differ in some people and give them anxiety or sometimes voice hearing or sometimes rapid, areas of either Great Depression or mania. And to do that, a psychiatrist who is a doctor and has then trained in psychiatry would look at something called either DSM, which is called Diagnostic Statistical Manual, or is it ISO? ICD, International Classification of Diseases. I'm stumbling over my acronyms today. And they're basically books that are published that help a psychiatrist diagnose things. And people can get a diagnosis. So someone might come and they may be very manic, and they would use a questionnaire and observation, and eventually they may come to a diagnosis of, bipolar, which would be someone is either very, very high or very, very low. And then they would be given medication. And the thing is that psychiatric diagnoses stick with you for life. It'd be very difficult to have taken off your medical records. It's not like having the flu, where you have the flu and then, you don't have it anymore. It usually stays on your medical records. And I think why therapists need to know what the terms mean is because, firstly, what we don't want to do is see clients just as a diagnosis and think that everything that they tell us is about their diagnosis. And I think, secondly, is to see the person. Someone might come and say, I was diagnosed with bipolar, but what actually does that mean? You could have someone who has been diagnosed with bipolar. I've got a friend who's been diagnosed with bipolar. You would never know. He's, every time I meet him, he's fine. Privately, sometimes he has very down days, and sometimes he's a bit high. But generally speaking, he doesn't take medication. He's fine. Other people that I've worked with, certainly when I worked in generic mental health, when I was a support worker, their behaviours would be very florid. You'd see them, being very animated and in some difficulty sometimes. So we have to engage with clients as human beings first and foremost. My message is, clients aren't the diagnosis. Clients are the client, and they have a diagnosis. We see the client first, and I think it's my call to action, or my call to arms, would be to get an understanding of what psychiatric diagnosis is first and foremost, so it doesn't frighten you, and we don't see the client just in terms of their psychiatric diagnosis, because that's only a part of them.
It is, yes. It's an interesting topic, and the reason why I kind of weighed in at the beginning of this, saying, I don't have a lot of experience in this. When my first job in counselling, Rory, was working in recovery services, and I was they put me on training to do triage or care planning and deep assessments when coming in. And as soon as there was a community mental health team involvement, or a mental health diagnosis, instantly within that intake, there was a high risk indicator that was kicked off, and it was referred to our clinical lead, who had the understanding. So I get that we should not see. We see the person, not the label. And I guess a very good starting point, if I was to see someone, a client, and they suggested that they had a diagnosis, I might be asking them first and foremost what support they have in place, and whether that support is aware that they are presenting for counselling. And I don't know if that's a good starting point, but I do recognise that there can be additional risks, and that we would need to have an understanding of the diagnosis in ways that they may present, that we wouldn't miss cues that may suggest that the person might be in distress. But I wonder now if, just by looking at this and saying what I've just said now, if I'm not now focusing on the diagnosis and not the person. And this is a scary line for me, and that's where I am on it. And as a result, when I was in private practice, I guess I was reluctant or a little afraid to take anyone that had a mental health diagnosis or was involved with the mental health team?
Yes. Well, I think that's the first thing, discovery, isn't it? And I think if someone is telling you something, there's a reason. As they famously say, all behaviour is goal directed, as Roger said. And if someone's telling you something, they want you to know. They want you to know that about them. So I think how I would proceed is by very gently just saying, "Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?" and see where that goes. You know, some people may take medication, some people may have a regular review. Most people who are in the system, in other words, either with the doctor or under the community mental health team, may or should have a regular review, because if you're taking psychiatric medication, it's usually, in my experience, regularly reviewed. You usually have a meeting either with the doctor or in some cases the psychiatrist, and they will speak to you about how the medication is and this type of thing, and how your life is. And I think that the people I've had present to me in very very general terms, an amalgam of people, is that there could be just to talk about what's happened to them. And I think that's a very good starting point where we work with people with mental health issues, not what's wrong with you, but what happened, and allow people to, talk about what they've come for. They've come for, like any other client, to talk about what's happened. So I think that's a good starting point. But you're right, Ken. You do have to think about risk. Is someone under the community mental health team, if they say, "I've recently been sectioned. I've just come off a section," in other words, where someone has been compulsorily detained under the Mental Health Act, or someone has been very, very unwell. I think that one would have to take a view whether you'd want to enact therapy, because as we know with therapy, things can get worse before they get better. And if someone isn't in a stable place, what can happen, it can make things worse. I have to say, I don't want to frighten people, it doesn't often happen. I think in my career, I've had a handful of people who presented with, I would say, a florid mental health condition where they're actively in some form of psychosis, and they were having treatment for it. So I think you have to get, the discovery when you meet them. I think you have to just do a little bit more investigation and take a view on whether proceeding with therapy would be in their best interest. And that sounds counterproductive. That's us being the expert. But sometimes you just have to make that call, I think.
Yeah. And I guess that's why I had this feelings around this topic of not wanting to do it wrong, not wanting to make it worse, and not having a full understanding of mental health at that level, because it's not what we study. But I'm also going to share the other side of this. So I do have personal experience with mental health diagnosis within my family, in my broader family. And I've been close to how that looks and plays out. And it was unknown to that person for decades, for most of their life, actually. And when the diagnosis came, they didn't change. They didn't change on how I knew them. They just had some information that certain chemicals at certain times would be produced in their brains that would play out in certain ways. And it was really that. So it was a biological functioning of this person. But what I learned from that is that the feelings that left them with were the same kind of presentations that we, certainly I saw on a daily basis, which was the bread and butter of counselling and psychotherapy. It's the same kind of feelings, the emotions that person was that might bring up, and I think that was a bit of learning for me, and I guess you've mentioned medication, and we've done more podcasts on medication as well. We would need to for me to be happy, I would need to have a robust assessment in place to be able to ask these questions up front, which should be a standard on any intake assessment, really. Definitely asking if the person is involved with the community mental health team, if they have been previously, and if they have any formal diagnosis, if they're on any medication. It's going to be in your contract. Understand what that is. Do some CPD, look it up, have an understanding of what that presentation, including what the medication might do. And I know that both in our student library and in our qualified library, Rory, you created a little booklet, which is like the standard medications that are usually prescribed within the UK and what their side effects can be and what they kind of do, so that we can kind of have a bit of an understanding around that. But outside of that, I think it's just about seeing the person for who they truly are, but at the same time, maybe having some invisible little triggers that might alert us. So, example, and you mentioned bipolar. If I had a client presenting with that, I might ask them what that looks like for them, because it's going to be as individual. You know, one person with, if you met one person with bipolar, you met one person with bipolar. It's the same as we say in neurodivergence. Every single person is unique, and it will show for them in certain ways. When a person is well, they're usually able to say how their condition might show up and what some of the triggers or warnings might be. And if they can share that information with us, we can have that invisible little trigger there and maybe weigh in again with that client if we were to see anything or if anything came up. But again, with me being a scholar and not well trained in this area, I found myself avoiding it. You know, it almost feels like it's shameful to say that, but that's the truth. And that was me in my practice. I found myself avoiding that kind of a client presentation because it just felt terribly complex. And I wonder if I didn't miss out on many years of being there, serving, and being in relationships with those that have those challenges, and certainly having see that in my family now. I'm not as scared as I used to be, and I think that's what kept me away, Rory. It was fear of doing it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. I mean, asking the client, so what does that mean for you, and where are you now, and trying to establish what well looks like, because a lot of people who have mental health diagnosis who just get on with their lives. You know, they take medication, or they may do other things. You know, they may be out of situations that cause them to have a psychiatric diagnosis. You know, trauma is one path to people developing what we call long-term mental health challenges. And also, what I would say is that there's a big movement now into what is mental health. You know, you mentioned chemicals in the brain. There would be some people who say it's nothing to do with chemicals in the brain, that there's no actual evidence that it's about chemicals in the brain. It's our whole concept of how we engage and understand different forms of being may not be biological. They may live somewhere else. So it is very tricky. And I think for me, it would be, okay, what does well look like? How long have you had a diagnosis? Tell me a little bit about what you do. It's basically getting a sense of how that person's dealing with it, and also what is it they want to look at. And it's not unusual for people who've had a very stressful life, who then go on to get a mental health diagnosis, then come to therapy because they probably want to talk about what might have led to this. And I'll make a final observation on this, Ken. One of the things that we often get asked is, what's the difference between psychotherapists and counsellors? And, you know, I laughingly say £40 an hour. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the psychotherapists I've spoken to, and I know a lot of people who've taken very long paths in training, have worked as their placement in a psychiatric unit with people with psychiatric issues. Their placements are in hospitals. Their placements are in places where they would see a wide variety of clients who are taking medication. And I think a lot of that work would lie in the psychoanalytical realm. So it is about thinking about our competence. If someone came to you, think, are you competent to work with this? And I think advice off your supervisor. Take advice off your supervisor, and there's no shame in gently saying, I don't think my level of skill will match you. You never say to clients, you're too complex, because they think they'll never get help again. But if you say, I think you might want to work with someone with a different skill set, and refer them on. But it was very interesting that the people I spoke to had spent a lot of time in secure units, in hospitals, on hospital wings, counselling people who'd had mental health issues. And also, I think there's an ethical issue here, in that we don't want to work beyond our competence. But, as a final thought, many people who have a diagnosis may live their lives quite happily, and in some cases, and I'm not presenting expertise on this, the more florid symptoms of, voice hearing or mania or deep depression may actually, in some people, kind of just disappear. It might settle itself down. It was referred to as the florid symptoms, where someone's in active psychosis. There's a lot to be thought about, and also making sure you've got the GP's details, the doctor's details. So if someone does become unwell, you've got somewhere to refer. But my message would be, learn a little bit about what mental health diagnosis is, terms like schizophrenia, bipolar, personality disorder, all those things. Find out what they are before you proceed. It's always good to have a kind of a working knowledge.
Thank you, Rory. It's a very interesting topic, and a topic maybe I would like to hear more about. Maybe there's a lecture, if there's a practitioner out there that works in this specialist area, get in touch, because I think it's a really interesting topic, and I can recognize I felt incompetent in it. I struggled to find CPD around this topic when I did look, but then again, in my life experience, I've had interesting opportunities to work with very high level individuals working within mental health, who themselves are, and as they self-proclaim, in recovery, mental health recovery. And I learned that there is a recovery and a relapse in mental health, and a person in recovery knows what their relapse looks like if they've traveled along a distance so far, and they can give that information out and live a wonderful, productive life where they contribute to society. And it's again, this all starts with equality and diversity, doesn't it? It's, as soon as there is any kind of otherness, there's a requirement to learn. I think that's how it is overcome. How the veil of murk is taken away is by learning and understanding and diving I saw the smile on the veil of murk there.
The veil of murk.
I'm going to copyright that statement. The veil of murk. I should write a book.
Yeah, that's a winning title, Ken. But it is. You're right. It is a very murky area, and I think that there's a really good book written by a number of authors, but one is Lucy Ann Johnson, called The Power Threat Meaning Framework. And one of the things that they talk about is thinking about what happened to you, what are the threats in your life, understanding meanings, and approaching mental health not through the lens of a diagnosis and this is what's wrong with you and you are, and that's the label that we're going to slap on you, but rather, you're experiencing these things because of something or events that have happened in your life, and as a consequence, you've developed this kind of way of being. As I say, it could be voice hearing. Not everybody with schizophrenia hears voices. I mean, that's the thing. And so it is a case of trying to understand the client and get that learning. And also realizing that the world of mental health and and the way it's diagnosed is changing, and it's changing rapidly. In a few years, we probably won't have the term schizophrenia. I believe they don't have it in France. It's called something like voice hearing, I think. And they're thinking of changing that in the UK to voice hearing or hallucinatory voice hearing, as opposed to a sort of, I don't know, a very clinical definition, one that's more humanistic. I think that there's a lot to be learned then, but my message would be get some CPD, ask around, and if there is anybody out there who counsels or is a psychotherapist who wants to be interviewed on the podcast, get in touch. We'd love to hear more about it.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you for bringing this topic that is today's ethical, sustainable practice. Speaking about interviewing counsellors and psychotherapists, the next section that we're going into is Practice Matters, where we bring you CPD or an interesting journey or story from somebody out there in the field, an expert in the field. And today's an interesting one, and one that is often called for. It is mapping the journey from studying going into practice. And I think this is interesting if you're a student, but I think it's interesting also if you're an established practitioner, what that journey looks like. You spoke to Alex, Rory. What can we expect in this?
Well, we first met Alex last year when she graduated from her counselling course. And we've agreed to meet her every year just to see what her journey is, to give you out there who've just graduated, or maybe even people in practice, an idea of what the journey looks like. So a year after she graduated, I caught up with her again, and this is the rest of her story to date. Last time I caught up with today's guest was back in episode 313, recorded in October 2024, where she shared her experience of transitioning from a student to a newly qualified counsellor. Just over a year on, she's joining us again to reflect on the next stage of her journey into practice and to offer her insights and observations from the road she's travelled so far. It's my great pleasure to welcome back Alex Gulland. Alex, you're so welcome.
Hi there. It's good to be here. It's been an interesting journey.
Yeah, it's a whole 12 months. And I just wonder, in that kind of transition from being student to qualified, what surprised you the most in that kind of journey? What surprises came up for you?
What surprised me? I really didn't know what to expect. And I know that when we originally spoke, we were talking about the fact that I was going to become a sole trader rather than a limited company. We went through all of that. And the sole trader route is obviously the best way to go. The fact that clients aren't going to come and batter down my door, because there are a lot of other counsellors out there. So I wasn't expecting clients to pop up on the horizon straight away, but it has been a little bit harder than I thought it would be to build up the client base. Okay,
and kind of what are the realities? How did they differ from what your training prepared you for? What's the difference between being, I guess, a student and actually going into practice as a sole trader?
Well, my training in particular it kind of gave you the practicalities, when I was at college, of what you need to do. But I think for our college, it might have been good to have somebody come in from the outside and just talk about what the situation is. As a group of students, the majority of us went off to be sole traders. 2 people went off to work for a company. I don't think anybody said it was going to be easy, but it really is kind of finding your way around, because it's a new world. So you have to work out, where should your membership be? Is it counselling directory? Obviously, you have to be with somebody like the BACP. But then there are lots of other places where you can go and register, where they promise you all kinds of things in terms of attracting clients. So I went through working out really the best places to be. So the BACP definitely registered with, got accreditation with them as well. Then also I found the best place for me to then sit was Psychotherapy Today, which is an international database. So those are the two places that I kind of settled with. And I think, you're just not, it's an unknown world, really. It really is. I mean, I don't know how it compares to when you first started out, but there's lots of different things to consider that we spoke about in the first interview. But it's very unknown.
Absolutely. And I think that, to be fair to colleges, they give you a qualification in therapeutic counselling, not running a business, and if you're going to be a sole trader, if you're going to go into practice as a sole trader, then you are effectively a business. You're running your own business, self-employed. But I take your point. I think it would have been useful to, have someone who is self-employed to be able to give you an idea on what to expect, and things like, should you be limited or should you be a sole trader, and where to register. I did pick up that you've got accredited. Did you think or see that accreditation was an important factor for developing your professional identity?
I don't know. It was just something as students we all did. So
Right.
it wasn't really questions. It's something we were told to do at college, and then we actually did. So nobody really questioned that. So yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't something you had in a business plan and thought, if I become accredited, I might become more attractive to clients. It might bring in more work.
I think you always think that, though, don't you? If you kind of like, if you're getting extra, if you can get extra job title, or if you can get extra letters after your name, or join another organisation, you think it's going to attract clients. But that's kind of what you're learning about.
Yeah, absolutely. Really. Is that the reality? Do you think, are clients attracted to you because you've become accredited, or you have, a specific ethical body? Has any clients actually kind of spoken to that?
Majority of clients that I've been working with, I've kind of pointed out to them where, kind of like where I'm registered and what body I'm part of. So I think, when clients are obviously coming to us as counsellors, they're in a state of a little bit of distress and maybe trauma sometimes. So I think they're just looking for a familiarity, as it were. Few have really asked me about my qualifications. I've kind of explained it all to them. So I don't think it does attract more clients, but it's obviously a good thing to have, so that, if you are. So I've been working a lot with local councils and young people who wanted to come to the animal therapy farm to have counselling there. So within all of that, you've got to make sure that you're accredited, that you're part of the BACP, but your DBS is up to date, all of those things. So in that respect, keeping it all in order is a really good thing.
Absolutely. And I would echo your observations, Alex, that very, very few clients when I was in private practice asked me for my qualifications, accreditations. They were more interested, as you say, in finding someone they could trust, a secure base, from an attachment point of view, to be able to talk about what was going on for them. And I always think there's a bit of a disconnect there between what we sometimes think attracts clients and what actually does.
Yeah, and I think it would be a great area to do some research in. Just looking at kind of what, it's obviously I know you guys give a really good a bit of advice on how to write your description, when you're putting it up on registers, and it's kind of like, it's not about you, it's about what you can offer people. But yeah, I think it's an important area to really focus on. People have to feel comfortable with you. I have noticed that there was one gentleman on our course, and he was literally inundated with clients. And I think that observation comes from the fact that I think the counselling profession is obviously populated by a lot of women.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really, really interesting that it's still, as I left teaching, which is going to be nearly 10 years ago now, there were more men coming in to become therapists. However, it was still more women than men, And also I found that when I went into private practice as a male therapist, I did get a lot of men who contacted me. In fact, I would say that 90% of my clients were men.
Yeah.
And when there was ever there was a big court case, I think in 2016, it was a football coach a male football coach who was found guilty of abusing the children he was coaching. They were mainly boys. My phone rang off the hook for about a week with people wanting to come in. So I think sometimes, being a male therapist was an advantage there. In terms of your journey, what helped you grow? What was it? Supervision, peers, CPD? Can you identify one area where you thought that was so useful or has helped you and supported you?
One of the things, and I think I mentioned this to you before when we spoke, it seems like a long time ago now, but I was going to try and get some kind of a part-time job to kind of like boost the income. So I got a job working as a tech admin on a training course, which I think you're familiar with, and that really helped. That kind of learning all the technical side of that, getting confident on Zoom, which I kind of was, but I learned more about it from doing that. But also by doing that, I was learning an awful lot and observing a lot about supervision. So, having that part-time job or kind of like freelance contract job has really, really helped. And so I got two jobs kind of like that. It's both with training companies. And that really helped. So you're working, but you're actually, you're accomplishing something because you're learning something new. You're meeting other counsellors, but also you get your CPD hours there as well. So having the jobs has been really, really, really good. And that's kind of, that's really kind of kept me going, both financially, but also kind of creatively as well, kind of, working out how to move forward. Because then what that unwraps is, what area do I want to really focus on? So for me, I found myself going down the attachment road, learning a lot about attachment, a lot about inner child, a lot about working with the shadow. And that's all come out because of those two part-time jobs. Yes. So whereas on the client side, that'll grow. I have no doubt that'll grow as they get more and more established. Getting a part-time job within the industries with a credible organisation is definitely something I would recommend that people do when they first start working as a counsellor or psychotherapist.
Yeah, and I would echo that. One of my first jobs was a support worker, and I learned more about the human condition being a support worker, both in mental health and in I work with people who come out of prison and resettlement. I was a resettlement worker. And I learnt a lot about an area of the world that I knew nothing about. And that helped me, certainly helped me understand a side of life that I never would have experienced had I not decided to work in it. And that really underpinned everything I did from there on. You've got a job as a tech. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about, because people thinking, well, what's that? What's a tech? What does that do? What is a tech?
The tech admin, so I'm allowed to say it was with Counselling Tutor.
Yes, by all means.
A very reputable company. And so Yeah, but what you're doing is you're basically holding the space for all those people that are coming on the training course to be a supervisor. And so you get a lot of people, they're all coming online, probably about 30 or 40 people within a group. And then it's your job to ensure that things run smoothly, that you're supporting the teachers, and that you're also ensuring, especially when people are first starting that course, that people are comfortable with how they're accessing the course, that you're there for them. And then throughout the course itself, you're then ensuring different aspects of that. So things like ensuring that they're being observed and moving them around within different groups, but you're responsible for kind of splitting them up into groups as well, and checking that everything is going okay there as a technical person. Initially, we were recording the sessions, but we've stopped doing that now. But that was another way of kind of ensuring that, that it was actually captured, but that was another part of the role. So really, as it was explained to me when I first started, it's actually quite honoured actually to be holding space for all those people and the tutors to ensure that they're in a safe space to learn.
Yes.
So I really recommend it. Bit of a baptism of fire when you first start, but that's the way you learn, isn't it? That's kind of.
It is, and for anyone interested, we do run a supervision course. It's online, where people could come in. We use Zoom, and Alex's role would be to facilitate the smooth working of Zoom, put people into breakout rooms, and in terms of recording, we used to record the actual lectures and put them online. So yeah, that's interesting. And I guess what you're seeing is a different side of the profession. It's like pulling the curtain back, because you'll have gone to supervision and been supervision as a therapist, but you'll be seeing the mechanisms of it, how the levers are pulled and who does what. Yeah.
And I now know what to look for in a good supervisor.
Yes, because you'll see how supervisors are trained.
How you train all the different modes, and what they should be asking and everything else. So it's been fascinating.
Now, I noticed from your website that you have a passion for equine-assisted therapy. How did you get into that? How did that start?
That started. I've always had a passion for horses, in nature, and when I kind of moved out to Essex, which was in 2015, I finally had the opportunity to kind of really realise my dream and be around horses. But I'd always known about equine therapy, equine-assisted learning. So that really was the time for me to start training. But I've always kind of had that passion. As a child, I was very unregulated. I wouldn't have been able to know that I was unregulated as a child though, but as a child, I was very unregulated, and being with horses was the thing that naturally regulated me. So it's kind of something that's been quite inherent in me. Is the horse as part of the therapeutic process is actually quite a magical thing. And it works for me. It's not for everybody, but it does definitely work for me.
Yeah, the horse is a secure base where it's consistent and you can regulate. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's a developing edge in psychotherapy, equine-assisted therapy. And did you find that your skills, your counselling training kind of aided you to develop that side of your practice?
For sure. And I think because I did the equine training first, and then that led, and then I thought, I need a little bit more training here. And then went in on the counselling side. It's definitely worked well working that way. And as you say, working outside, working in nature, working with. Often what's happening is when you're working outside or you're working with animals in any ways, it's connecting with that right-hand side of your brain, the creative side of the brain. So sometimes what I'm doing is non-verbal while I'm observing, and then we kind of move throughout the session processing various emotions as a result of the first observations. But because you don't know really how the horse is going to react or the pony is going to react or how the client's going to react to the pony. Like every counselling session, I suppose, you can't really predict it or even attempt to control it. You just got to let it play out. But it is a fascinating area, one that I love.
And is your client base adults, children, or is it a mix?
It's a mix. It's a mixture of young adults and children from local schools.
Yeah. And of course, I guess I'm just writing something on attachment now. In fact, I've just before we met, I've just kind of put my PowerPoint down, and attachment is a massive part of therapy. Yeah. Was that something you were taught in your first trainings, attachment, to any great depth?
We touched on it. We kind of touched on the initial, the existence of it, how it was created, Bobby's kind of the various research that he'd done. But it was something that really stuck with me, because for me, it explained a lot of my makeup from childhood because of ambivalent attachment with my mother. I was able to kind of put things into places in terms of my development psychologically. So it's one of those things that, if you're really interested in something, you tend to absorb it a lot better. But if you're really interested in something and it applies to you, it's even more interesting. It tends to be a lot more sticky in terms of how you retain that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think that we learn best when the stories are parallel to us, when we're learning something that is meaningful to us. And have you, keeping within confidentiality, have you come across any sort of memorable moments or transformations you've witnessed when working with clients and horses or ponies?
I've had people come to me, and this is in the early days, very kind of, there was a life coach that came to see me, and she was very kind of, she used to fill stadiums with audiences and train people that way. She was quite well known, but she wanted to come and meet the horse that I was working with, and that was actually and she had big energy. She's like one of these people that you meet and it's like, whoa. But I guess she has to be like that to maintain the position that she has. But she was barely kind of really listening into what I was talking to her about in terms of how it works. So a lot of it is making people aware of their body language and their energy levels before they approach the horse itself. To dive straight in there and just start patting the horse and hugging it and expecting it to connect with you, it's a bit like meeting a stranger on the street and giving them a hug and a smack on the cheek. It's kind of like you've got to kind of really grow that relationship. So I could see that she wasn't really retaining what I was saying. And eventually at the end of the session, she said, I wonder if he'll follow me. And I said, well, it's quite a rare thing to do. They call it joining up. When you're working with horses, and they naturally want to be with you because you're part of their herd, and you really have to establish a close bond with the horse or pony to enable them to do that. So she marched into the paddock and he had his halter on. She took hold of his halter, but he was having none of it. And then she started walking and he just didn't want to be anywhere near her. So that was somebody kind of like bringing outside energy, very much energy from the outside world that she lived in into nature, and thinking, I can dominate this. I'm very much playing kind of almost like the predatory role. And in therapy, in equine therapy, that just doesn't work. But I wouldn't
imagine it works in relationships either too well. If someone's like that, I wouldn't imagine that. It'd be very difficult to form a relationship with someone who has so much energy you don't have time to breathe.
Yeah, just like, just follow me. But I think, especially with young people, when they're observing ponies in the field, that can be quite interesting, because you'll get the child, or you'll ask the child to choose a horse or a pony that they want to work with. So dependent on where that client is at in terms of, what they're looking at working on, the horse or pony that they choose can often help explain where they're at in their head. So it could be that they want to go for the horse or the pony that's on their own, that's not with the herd. They could maybe want to go with the dominant horse that's there, the biggest horse, the smallest horse. So there's all kinds of different things that you can kind of like look at in terms of being able to read the horses, but also the client as well. Not that you can never really read a client, but it does really help.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like you've combined a passion and taken that to build yourself part of your career, which I think is an interesting way to go. Usually, I think careers develop where someone's got a passion for something and then they develop a career around it, because there's a genuine interest.
Yeah, yeah.
So as we come to the end of our time together, I've got a couple of questions that I think might be enlightening for everybody. Would you wish you'd have known during training?
What would I known during training? I don't know, actually. That's a really difficult one. I suppose it would have been good to have known. A lot of us, I think, within our group, within the college, there was a fear there of silence sometimes, sitting in a counselling room, and you think you've got to fill that silence all the time. But then, through my placement and then since working with clients, sometimes that silence is quite a sacred space. So I would have been great to have known more about that and how that works, and it sounds like a weird thing, but to teach you to sit in silence. I think I would have maybe liked to have learned more about attachment, because I think attachment to me, and now I'm kind of like the number one fan, I think that's the key to everything. But yeah, it would have been good to know about that. Reputable places to go, to train with. So I'm doing some courses which will develop over the next couple of years. But it's kind of like, where, if you wanted to do CBT, where would be the best place to go? Is it good to do it online? That kind of stuff. Like, how do you then advance? So that would have been good to know if I was a student. But I think the silence thing, more training and sitting in silence would have been helpful.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation, because, there are, I think sometimes people leave training with areas that not quite kind of develop for themselves. It's not unusual, I have to say. But it sounds to me like your curiosity is now leading you down the path of kind of finding out about it and kind of filling that gap, if you like.
Yeah, and that's the wonderful thing about when you have your own practice. You are then, you can open yourself up to all kinds of different types of training. So either with organisations like yourself to work within, or independently, doing lots of different courses. So that's, I think that for me is one of the most exciting things is just keep on learning, don't you? There's so much out there to learn.
Well, I think on those wise words, keep on learning. Alex Gulland, thank you for joining us. And I'd invite you again maybe to catch up next year and see what another year has brought to you.
We love that. Love to see you again.
All right. Well, we'll see you next year, Alex.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com. Thank you very much to Alex. Thank you to you, Rory, for holding those all-important discussions. It's great to have the anchors in place from graduation through to going into practice a year later. And I think that we can probably link in our show notes to the last interview that was done with Alex. And to find this podcast episode, you just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, and this is episode 362. You'll find all the information that Rory and I have discussed there, including some additional links to dive a little bit deeper on some of the topics, and we'll put the link in for Alex's last interview that was done, so you have the full story if you missed out on that. And that now leads us directly into student services. And in student services, we recognize you, the students, on your formal journey. And today we're speaking about a really, really important topic. It's that confidentiality that we hold so dear in counselling and psychotherapy. Yet, we are often asked to write about a client presentation, specifically in our final year work. We've got to write a case study of a client. How do we balance confidentiality yet having to do a case study or use a living example? So that's today's topic, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anybody who's ever done any form of counsellor training, certainly at practice level, will have written a case study. And I think there's the couple of things. One is which client do you pick? Now, in the awarding body board that Ken and myself taught in, you weren't allowed to use actual real clients. How they worked it was that you did an advanced skills session with a peer and then wrote that up as your case study. And then you had a supervision case study where you could talk about something that happened with the clients and how you work with it. Now, whether that's changed now, a lot of water under the bridge since we taught, Ken. I'm sure the awarding bodies have changed. But one of the things to think about is what do you put in a case study? And also being very realistic. Case studies are how we learn. If you look at Rogers' work, I had the Carl Rogers reader for a bit, and that's a book of an amalgam of all his work. And he talks a lot about some of the clients he'd worked with. But what he did is he anonymized them. He just talked about certain aspects of what the client was experiencing and linked that to theory. So it's not like you might see in some books where you get psychotherapists writing about their clients and they tell you a whole story about their clients, who they are, what they look like, how they presented, what happened, all that kind of thing. What you're doing is you're answering the question. You're being asked a question. How would you use empathy? And it would give an example of what the client said and how you responded. So you're taking little snippets of information and using those to evidence what you've learned, as opposed to writing a complete story. And I think that's a very, very good starting point. I think a good rule of thumb is that someone should be able to look at your work and say, yes, they've obviously understood what empathy is or understood what unconditional positive regard was, without being able to actually identify who the client was. And hopefully, I think tutors are giving really good guidance on this, on how to write case studies without giving too much away, if you like, Ken.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll get on to the steps for anonymizing in a moment. But I wanted to pick this up, Rory, just looking at what is available already. And there are already existing frameworks that we can look at. The BACP, UKCP, NCPS are going to have guidance on that. And as an example, BACP ethics, they have a good practice in action fact sheet that speaks about client consent, anonymity, confidentiality, and the impact of writing a client's material when we are therapists. So that's worth looking at. So a good starting point is to look to your ethical body, whatever that may be, and ask or do a search on the site to look at how this may be done. And then secondly, and this is more from a legal perspective, that we're bound by laws. If somebody is giving us their data or sharing their data with us, the ICO definitely suggests that data is held in a way that it cannot be identified. Now, I know that this may be slightly different because this might be speaking about records and things like that, but I still think it's a good guidance looking to the ICO because they actually have anonymization guidelines that you can use, and you can go to the ICO website and have a look at that. And then, of course, awarding bodies such as CPCAB, they have case study materials repeatedly stressing that maintain confidentiality. So this is a shout out to the students that are taking their course, and they do provide lessons on anonymizers, using initials rather than names, and we'll go into some of what they may look like, what that anonymizing may look like, that you might use in your assignments. And of course, you need to do your own research on this. Make sure that you have a full understanding of it. Speak to your tutor if you are unsure. But there are different categories of identifying information. So what you would start by thinking about is what category does this fall into. So within the ICO and within the laws in the UK of how we treat data, as a counsellor or psychotherapist, we're dealing with what is called special protected data, and this is data that may involve people's medical records, their mental health history, that kind of stuff, and it is treated differently by the law. So it's really interesting to look at what the different layers are. So layer A is along direct identifiers, and we would be avoiding these. This is somebody's name, their address, their postcode, their email, their phone, their workplace, the school that went to, their date of birth, any number, their unique membership numbers, anything like that would give the person away. Role and then indirect identifiers could be things like the exact age of a person, their exact job title, their exact location of where they are in the world. So you wouldn't want to give their exact town. You would want to broaden that out there. Anything that is really rare that you'd go, wow, that's really strange. But the person themselves will go, well, that happened to me and that's really rare and it doesn't happen often. So anything that's really rare or an unusual life event or sequence would be anonymized. And then specific dates, times, very specific relationship considerations. And then we go into jigsaw details. So these are the ones that if you have a couple of pieces and you put them together, you can go, aha! So a distinctive cluster. So 55, female only counsellor in X village, partner is a vicar. It kind of gives away, those little pieces together will give away too much information that we don't particularly need to share. And then layer B, you'd only include details that are needed. So this is almost like Caldecott. So Caldecott principles suggest you only put in the information that is definitely required to get that learning or that information over. So if you're writing an assignment and they're asking you specific questions, only answer the question. It in a relevant context. It might be a presenting issue, the context, the formulation, the hypothesis of what you were thinking, what you did and why you did it, the skills you used, the theory you used, what the ethical ramifications were around that, and what a client may have responded to and how you may have reflected that. You can see that that is very much anonymized. It's more about you and what you were doing rather than that person and what they were showing with. The presentation is very, very small. And then layer C is disguised safely. So this is without breaking the clinical meaning, but you may change things. You may put in pseudonyms. You may put in additional information. Now, I know we've done this at times. We've anonymized things that we've used in our student library. where we've changed details, particularly doing this disguise, so that it is definitely not. If the person was to read it themselves, they wouldn't even see themselves. And things like that can be changing a man to a woman is one, just a simple way of doing that. So age, you can instead of using the person's age, you can give an age bracket. You can say location, you can widen it to a country or a large area. So, Rory, you might say Greater Manchester because it's massive. There's millions of people there. And in jobs, if it had to be brought in, you might put a larger role in. So you might say something like works in healthcare, for example. So you wouldn't say a nurse working at X hospital. So you would try to generalize that. Any family details, you will keep the structure relevant to formulation and change non-essential specific, so you wouldn't go into who their family relationships are and things like that. In the last example we use with married to a vicar, I don't know how that would be relevant in any way in any kind of case study and information. And uniqueness, you want to be removing that. If something is rare, a very specific incident, consider either removing it, generalizing it, or using a vignette approach. So no real client representation. I know we do that from time to time, Rory, if we're bringing things in. We will really take... you did it today. Rory. We were speaking and you said... you were sharing a little bit of experience, and you did it over a range of clients as opposed to a client. So you were bringing a pattern, not an individual. And then layer D is test the risk. And to test the risk, this is the question you want to ask yourself. Self-recognition test is, if this person was to hear what you're saying, see the video, read the document, whatever the medium is that you're putting this over in, would they go, hold on a minute, that's me? Third party test is somebody who knows that person was to hear, read, see. Would they think, oh, I know that person? Small community test. If you were in a small community and everybody knows each other, and I live in a small community. I live in a tiny little village where everybody knows what everyone else is doing. If I was counselling somebody in a small community, I might be a little careful of how I might put that information out, because it is a small community. And then consent, do you need it? So I think from my point of view, certainly when I was doing my training and I was writing case studies, I got consent. I told the person about anonymisation and how we would do that, and how no identifying characteristics of who they actually are would be in that. And it would be more about a presentation and then how I worked with that. And I gained their informed consent before going ahead with that. So that's a simple rule. If you can, if you are using someone else's, even a part of their journey, and you can ask for their consent to do so, you can do so. And of course, where can you go and learn more? Certainly, definitely start with your ethical body. Look up ICO. It's a great website if you're based in the UK, and look up the keyword is anonymisation guidance. There's an anonymisation guidance hub in the ICO. It's really, really supportive and useful. Look to your training provider. If it's CPCAB, they definitely have guidance around this as well, Rory. And I know we're going to be going to Sarah in a moment, but any thoughts before we hand over to our roving reporter on the ground, Sarah?
I think that is quite very comprehensive. You've gone through quite a comprehensive list. I think the other thing I'd add to that is that, we see many of the same presentations in therapy. So loss, or loss is a good one. Or we might see people who have post-traumatic stress, or we might see people who are navigating a difficult relationship. And if you write about someone navigating a difficult relationship, someone might look at that and say, "Well, that could be me, because I'm going through a very difficult relationship and seeing a therapist. The acid test, if you like, is if you could look at that and say, that is, I don't know, Rory Lees Oakes, who lives at 57 Ackroyd Street, big town, and there's enough information in that case study to identify that person. And I'm going to make a bit of a point. The way we learn is by case studies. Doctors do it, psychiatrists do it, psychotherapists do it, counsellors do it. It gives us a chance to look at how theories applied and what happens next. And if we don't have case studies, then we lose a very important part of how therapy is enacted and how the curative factor plays out or not. So I think it really, really is important. And, we're joined now by Sarah Henry.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
So, hello, Sarah. How are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm spiffing.
What's that?
It's not a very old English word, I think, for good. I'm fine. I should have said that in the first place.
Excellent.
So, you heard Ken and myself talk about, the idea that at some point a student will have to write a case study, talk about material that a client's brought to evidence either use of supervision or application of theory. I wonder what your thoughts are on the kind of confidentiality aspect of that.
Yeah, I think a case study is the first real time that a student has to walk the walk when it comes to putting into practice what it is that they've been learning. So starting to really explore and delineate between confidentiality and anonymity, and considering when it is that they're actually sharing client data for no good reason, and if they could actually preserve a client's anonymity on a greater level by keeping some information out of their case study.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? If you say I was working with someone whose pet cat had died, and I'm sorry if any listeners' pet cats recently died, but it might be that 4 or 5 people listening to that might go, I know someone who went to therapy because the pet cat had died. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, there are a number of things that clients present with which are universal: bereavement, loss, trauma, self-confidence. So, they are going to overlap. If you've said, a client presented and their pet cat had died and they were called Rory Lees Oakes, mm-hmm. that would be then a little bit more explicit, and people would go, oh, Rory's gone to therapy because his pet cat has died. I haven't got a pet cat, by the way, people listening, but I think you're getting the idea of what I'm trying to put over. The more detail, the more granular, I guess, the more chance of the client being recognised.
Absolutely that. And it's I always encourage to start with the information that is required. So when writing a case study, if you are talking about a client's incongruence, for example, then only offer the information that explicitly pertains to that incongruence in order to illustrate your point. Otherwise, what we can end up doing is being somewhat cavalier and flippant with client details and sharing things that are unnecessary, and actually paint a more specific picture of the person that you're talking about beyond the purpose of the case study.
So it comes down to answer the question.
Answer the question and only the question. And also pay attention to if you yourself kind of feel as though things are starting to feel a bit this is a bit juicy or this is a bit interesting, and you're putting information in your case study because you just really want to talk to somebody about it. It's an important thing to recognise, because confidentiality is the cornerstone of the trust that's built in the relationship. So without kind of shaming or chastising yourself, is there a reason why you have the desire to put more information in a case study than is necessary?
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's the more information you give, the more identifiable the person may be. So, if you talk about someone, as I recently did in a podcast, maybe leaving the therapy room, getting hold of the doorknob and saying, I'm in debt for £100,000, a fictitious amount of money, and I have to say, then it doesn't really identify anybody, because that could be anybody who's ever been to therapy because they have a debt. It's a bit different by saying, I'm in debt for £100,000 and, they live at 47 Ackroyd Street, Bolton. If there is an Ackroyd Street in Bolton, I'm sure there is. And that then makes them more identifiable. And it's about I think it's about the wisdom to balance it out, isn't it?
Yeah, the wisdom. And that starts with, why am I sharing this? What benefit is there to me sharing this particular bit of information? The case study is ultimately an academic exercise. So the purpose of sharing things is to demonstrate your knowledge, and only that knowledge. So yeah, if it's necessary, if it's illustrative, then add it. And if you think, I could retract the fact that my client is blonde because it makes no difference to the amount of debt that they were talking about, that's not the challenge that I faced in the session, then remove that. Because I always, it's much easier to err on the side of caution when it comes to the preservation of someone's identity, in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because there has been criticism, as Ken and myself talked about, where therapeutic writers have published whole stories about clients, and it's come to light that the clients recognise themselves, and there's so much detail that it could only be them, and as a consequence of that, they felt a bit aggrieved. And so there's a bit of a difference between writing an entire journey of someone in therapy and the idiosyncrasies that the client might have, than just talking about a specific snapshot to illustrate theory. Would you say that was a?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that there's such a significant difference between the two of those. And I'd also say on top of that a generic, loose idea of, a made-up client who has issues with debt or issues with pet bereavement, etc. In itself, it can illustrate the point above and beyond going into any detail of anyone, full stop. As a tutor, I draw on experiences that I've had in client work to illustrate points, but that's always something that is not only considered for the benefit of my students, but with the preservation of client identity. So having a waiver for those specific things in my work is the way that I've navigated around that. And when it comes to a case study, being really, really clear in the contracting with clients as to what it is that you're going to be doing with the recording that you've captured, how you're going to be preserving their data and their identity in that, and who it is that you're going to be sharing that with. All those bits are really important, and you can practice that when it comes to reviewing the work if you've not yet started your case study.
That's really interesting, because you talked about recording clients' information. Some awarding bodies say no, don't do that. Just review it. Just do a advanced skills session with your peers in class. So it's always worth checking, I think, with your tutor. Some universities, awarding bodies, say you can use that information. So you could use a live or a section transcript, if you like, from real client interaction. So I think there's something there about being transparent in the contracting. What would you suggest the student does if they're going down the route of maybe using a section from a transcript?
Well, like you said, get clarification from your tutor about what the actual requirement of the case study is. Also then speaking to the other people within that 4-way contract. So is there an agency policy that prohibits using client data? Checking that out with your agency manager. And then also just doing your ethical diligence in working with your supervisor.
Yeah.
You know, are there some things I need to check out for? This is an advancement or a development in my practice. What would you say are the safe bets with things like using pseudonyms or initials, etc.? I think those 3 places, those 3 points of call are all there to be supportive.
Yeah.
And you can use that support as your practice develops if it includes using client data in order to enrich your learning experience. And then practice communicating that.
Yeah.
You know, are you clear on what you're going to do with the recording, transcript, etc.? Are you able to articulate that in a way that instills confidence in the client and not kind of you tripping over words or not being able to be clear? So yeah, just practice before you go in with clients, practice with peers in skills sessions. How would you go about communicating that, and how would you respond if a client said no, which of course is their right to?
Yeah, and I think also my view would always be that if you are going to use a client, or you're going into that phase of your training where you might be asking clients, is to ask them at the beginning of the of where you connect the first session, would it be all right as a student if I record, as opposed to at the end where they may feel a bit honour bound to say yes, a bit browbeaten into saying yes, and of course there's a whole data protection piece around that now with the UK GDPR. You know, how is it going to be? How is that information going to be stored? Who's going to listen to it? How long? You know, so I think it's essential that you check with your tutor, your supervisor. Should you be recording? Yeah. Some may have a definite view on that and say absolutely not. Any final thoughts on just?
A final thought. I would say that when it comes to doing a case study, capturing client data, etc., the ways in which you're going to use it, it is always better to be patient with establishing and clarifying the boundaries than running ahead and having to repair something that was damaged through an excited and hurried process.
Yeah. And I think my final observation, thank you for that, Sarah. My final observation is don't put your studies before your client. You know, yes, you may have to do a tape with a client. Yes, or recording. We don't use tapes anymore, but or some people may. Who knows? But don't put that eagerness to tick that part of the course off and get it under your belt over the well-being, the wishes, and the appropriateness of recording with a client. Always check with your tutors, the awarding body, your supervisors. Check, double check, and check again would be my view.
Take that time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, Sarah, and back to you, Ken, in the studio.
Massive thank you to Sarah Henry. Lovely to hear from our roving reporter again. And always a thank you to you, Rory. You're always out and about speaking to our roving reporters. And I wanted to leave you with one last keyword when you're doing your research, if you want to delve a little bit deeper into this. So it is pseudonymization. So it's PSUDOYMISATION, pseudonymization. It's a great... it's kind of the same kind of thing. If you go into the ICO website, they've got a pseudonymization page there. It was a new word for me that I found when I was researching for this topic. And it's an interesting one. Go and have a look at it. This has been episode 362 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started off in ethical sustainable practice talking about working with clients with a psychiatric diagnosis, and we delved into what you may have to think about, what questions you may have to ask. In Practice Matters, we caught up with Alex Gulland, who talked about her journey so far from graduating. We met her a year ago, and we're going to catch up with her every year. And if you go to episode 362, we'll put a link to the first interview she had as she moved from being on the cusp of moving from a student to a qualified practitioner. And in student services, confidentiality in counselling case studies. We talked at depth about how to anonymise and how to use an anonymous data to be able to support your writing of case studies, application of theory to practice. And of course, we were joined by Sarah Henry, who was our outside reporter, who gave her view on this. As always, thank you so much for your likes, comments and subscribes. And until we meet again, stay grounded and stay safe.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.